Welcome to Advice for Grad Students. I'm your host, Phil Haun, and with me today is a colleague, and we were in grad school together, Sameer Lalwani. Welcome to Advice for Grad Students.
Thank you.
And sure, and just a reminder that the views expressed today are our own and not of our institutions. And Sameer has been gracious enough to talk to us today about considering non-academic careers. So Sameer, over to you.
Great. Well, thanks for inviting me on this, Phil. I suppose I'll start with a question. I'll have some what, a why, and then maybe a how of non-academic careers to a degree. So the what is, what are these non-academic careers where you have developed skills uh, with your doctorate that you want to apply, but may not want to go into academia. And what I mean by that is a tenure track research institution, but want to apply your skills elsewhere. And I think there's some obvious ones that we probably are familiar with, but I'll just talk about them briefly. Think tanks, there's the private sector, and then there's the US government itself, and a lot of both applied and thoughtful entities within the US government that function as sorts of think tanks or clearinghouses for ideas. I personally have more experience in the think tank world than in the private sector, so I'll speak to that. But I think from what I have seen, even in the private sector, talking to colleagues, for example, in defense companies that all sort of have internal research outfits that are about studying the changing character of war, and then having obviously some planning and strategies that are appropriate for that. But I think every entity has this kind of sort of in-house think institution where there's some expectation of your own original research, synthesizing original research that's out there in academia, and then translating it, making it relevant for decision makers. And if that's policymakers in government or decision makers within a company or a structure of some sort, then that's your mission, but it draws upon your academic skills to do that. I think that the why, maybe we'll get into the why for a minute. My own reasoning is for personal reasons. I wanted to be located in a place where my spouse was employed, and there are some academic jobs in my location, but they weren't necessarily available at the time that I was in the job market. And even so, it's a challenging job market. So you sort of have to decide that, what your objectives are in life and what you want out of it. For me, it was being close. I didn't want to have sort of to be separated from a spouse, wanted to be sort of in the same area, and chose a career pathway that opened up for that. There are other reasons to consider it independent of your personal constraints. I think I would make the argument, though I can't say this authoritatively, that there's a pay scale difference in a number of other sectors that could be appealing to some people, particularly in the junior faculty to mid-tier level. I think as you sort of ascend in the ranks, it probably evens out in the long run, but there are maybe some competitive incentives for that. There's different missions, obviously, right? Like the core mission of working in a think tank, at least a US think tank that's based in Washington, D.C., is about influencing policy decision making. Some of that is oriented around international policy decision making or international institutions. But I think for the most part, a lot of think tanks in Washington, D.C. are focused on influencing U.S. government policy decision making. And so to the degree that you care or invested in that and want your research to have implications on that, it's a good reason to consider working within a think tank. I would say there's also an argument as to why academics or people with sophisticated doctoral training can do well in organizations like this. I think they have some competitive advantages, particularly in diagnosing problems. I think oftentimes there's an assumption both within the policy institutions, but also amongst academics, that their comparative advantage is methodological rigor. That might be true to a degree, but I have found, at least in my experience, that the more valuable skill set that you develop in graduate school that makes you unique in policy, think tank, government environments is concept formation. Your ability to identify a set of phenomena or empirical phenomena and organize it in a way that is meaningful and tractable for policymakers. So to me, that might be sort of more conceptualization might be more important than methodological rigor. But in both cases, I think research design is an important part if you want to diagnose a problem, how you go about researching and designing a study to understand it. I think that's something that you get uniquely trained in graduate school that people in law school or engineering school or med school just don't have the same sort of access to, that gives you, again, a comparative advantage. Again, how to think about, why, if you have a sort of a competitive choice between a non-academic career, and maybe we should even sort of practice, not call it non-academic, but academic adjacent or something like that. Because I think what I'm going to say is that there's a lot of functions of academia that exist. Again, I'll speak to a think tank world that exists here, and you can capture a lot of it without having to sort of settle for other things that might be sort of downsides of sort of an academic research institution or university setting. So teaching, I think, is sort of obviously something that many academics are invested in. I will say that there is no shortage of opportunities for adjunct teaching at universities, certainly in Washington, D.C., but I've heard this around the country. There's no shortage of it. There's plenty of master's and undergraduate and graduate programs that are looking for people, not just to teach sort of public policy courses, but to teach actual, intro to IR, to more sophisticated seminars on IR concepts applied to a particular domain or something like that. Academic publishing, it depends on the institution you're at. The incentives are obviously different, but I have not found them to be opposed to academic publishing. In fact, sometimes there's actual incentives for it and real value in it. But I think you can do academic publishing while at think tanks and institutions that see U.S. governments, people who work in U.S. governments and then sort of rotate out of it, have come away with materials and insights and empirics that are useful for academic publishing. Certainly academic conferencing, I think, is actually encouraged in most of these settings because there's sort of the osmosis and the generation of ideas happens sort of in those conferences, or at least exposure to new ideas and concepts and empirics. So those are, I think, strongly encouraged in all these settings. And then I think there's a question, like if you are interested in research and you think that you really want to drive research with sophisticated data collection, data generation, I think there's actually opportunities to do that again in academic adjacent research institutions. So I think there's a premium throughout the think tank community these days on data set creation, sort of real-time data set generation, but also creating data sets from sort of past empirics and past phenomena. I've found that surveys and survey experiments are being encouraged and funded by think tanks or entities that support think tanks. Obviously, field research is maybe a central part of a lot of research that happens within the policy community in Washington, D.C. And you can choose to sort of make that more rigorous and standardized in terms of your interview questions and the way you go about it. But I think that's another sort of methodology that is encouraged within these entities.
All right.
And then I think, sorry, go ahead.
Well, maybe you were getting to this, but Sameer,
Yeah.
You've told us the what, the why. Let's get to the how. As a grad student,
Oh, yeah.
how does they think about, what are the things they can do to figure out whether or not this might be a path for them?
Look, I think the easiest thing to do is, particularly students who are already working in domains that intersect policy questions or military operations questions, is to come talk to the operators, talk to the decision makers and policy decision makers who think about these problem sets, present the findings of their research, present their analysis, and see what kind of feedback they get. There either will be clear demand signals, or there might be some head scratching, and either way you get a sense of whether the areas of research you want to pursue are well suited to the customers, let's say, in the Washington, D.C. policy environment. As a graduate student, I was working on my dissertation topic was on counterinsurgency in South Asia, which, as I was a grad student from 2008 to 2014, was a highly sought after topic within the policy environment. And so I found very receptive audiences and open doors to brief on my work and my findings, and encouragement to work on it within policy institutions. So places like the Rand Corporation, where essentially I got to work on my dissertation while doing a summer associateship there. So I think it's just a matter of like trial and error. I think I would say that even a bad experience in Washington is a learning experience. There are ways in which you will understand how this, and there are dysfunctions obviously to how information is collected and sought after in Washington that obviously need to be amended and corrected. But I think that just direct exposure is probably the easiest thing to do. The second maybe would be, once you have a set of direct exposures and contacts, maintaining that Rolodex or that set of contacts, keeping people updated on what you're doing, sending updates on your work, especially if there are publications or synopses of your work, dissertation summaries, or sort of short snippets that describe what you're doing. I think I've been surprised that people read stuff and then may not respond to it right away, but will remember it sort of several years later. So it's good to sort of maintain those points of contact. And I think a third thing is, again, if you want to, I hate to say the term hedge, but sort of keep options open for policy audiences, you just got to remember what it is that you get, that you have or are able to do that is not easily accessible for most practitioners in the policy environment. I'd say one of the most important things, especially for comparativists or people who do a lot of field work, is getting outside the wire. So basically, most US government officials, practitioners, or people even adjacent to it tend to sort of operate in capital cities, even if they're traveling internationally, tend to operate close to the embassy, green zone environment, stay within the diplomatic quarters, don't really talk to people, have a harder time, let's say, talking to people outside of that. There's clearly a demand for it and interest in it, but maybe sort of like both sort of security restrictions as well as a lack of situational awareness makes it harder. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying that this is great advice, and I particularly hadn't thought about that last piece. All right, so we've about come to the end of the time on this fascinating discussion today on non-academic careers.